It's not a secret that Mount Everest is the highest and scariest peak in the entire world. While some people have succeeded in getting to the top, there were at least thousands of expert mountaineers who have tragically failed and fell to their deaths. This is the tragic story of Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker. The three Pinnacles are a formation of steep rocks along the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. They were one of the most extended unsolved challenges at the highest level of mountaineering, but have now been successfully climbed. The rocks are located at almost 7,800, 8,100, and 8,200 meters above sea level, which is the height of the base of the pinnacle, and are already in the death zone, in which people cannot usually recover, even when at rest. On Everest, the typical routes avoid this region. The typical northern route passes it on the left. Serious issues and fatalities frequently happen throughout the several attempts to scale the Pinnacles and create a new route along the entire northeast ridge. In the first significant attempt to climb in groups at grade 5 within the danger zone, Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker perished in 1982. The climbers Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker were last seen at roughly 27,000 feet late on May 17, 1982, as they prepared to ascend a second rock and ice pinnacle on the mountain's unclimbed east-northeast ridge. They were never seen again once radio communication was lost. 2 days earlier, at around 26,500 feet, the sole woman on an American group marking the first climb on Mount Everest's north face was murdered. Marty Hoy, a mountain guide from Tacoma, Washington, plummeted thousands of feet into a chasm. Her body could not be found. Both crews failed to climb the world's highest peak without using oxygen. Members began returning to Peking on Saturday. The leader appeared to be shaken. Mr. Boardman and Mr. Tasker's absence was not made public until Saturday, when the expedition's commander, Chris Bonington, returned. He was devastated by the setback and only talked to a small number of British journalists. Mr. Bonington stated in his report to the Chinese Mountaineering Association, a copy of which was made public, that while he looked from below via binoculars, his two red-suited comrades vanished at twilight behind the second of two large pinnacles. Mr. Bonington, who was too tired to pursue them, came to the conclusion that Mr. Boardman and Mr. Tasker had fallen down the 10,000-foot Kangshung cliff, which is covered in extremely steep snow. It seemed unimaginable that they could have remained out of sight for 4 nights and 5 days unless some calamity occurred, particularly at that altitude, where the human body deteriorates extremely fast, especially when they were not utilizing oxygen. Mr. Bonington wrote in his report, 4 major climbers. Mr. Bonington's trip consisted of just 4 main climbers and 2 support climbers, which he admitted was a pretty tiny group for such a large peak. Dick Renshaw, one of the major climbers, had been evacuated due to stroke symptoms produced by high altitude, leaving Mr. Boardman and Mr. Tasker to lead the main attack, with Mr. Bonington, 47, and Adrian Gordon, a support climber, assisting them. All of us expressed while we were doing the climb that it was the most arduous climb any of us had ever undertaken. But it was a worthwhile, exciting challenge, and Pete and Joe were very nearly in sight of complete success. And it's just tragic that this happened to them, said Mr. Bonington, who led a successful ascent of Everest from Nepal in 1975. Mr. Boardman and Mr. Tasker's disappearance is reminiscent of a mystery that happened in 1924, when 2 members of a British expedition, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, vanished. After being sighted fewer than 1,000 feet from the summit, people have speculated about whether they finished the ascent before being slain for over half a century. Mount Everest was not ascended officially until 1953. Mr. Boardman, who was 31 and married at the time, climbed Mount Everest on the British assault of the northwest base from Nepal in 1975, and Kanchenjunga, the world's 3rd highest peak, without oxygen in 1979. He took over as the director of the International School of Mountaineering in Lausanne, Switzerland, and is the author of a contemporary classic. Mr. Tasker, 33 and unmarried, had an exceptional climbing resume. He made the first British winter ascent of the Eiger's north face in Switzerland and climbed up Kanchenjunga without oxygen. Both climbers were best known for their 2-person ascent of the sheer west wall of India's 22,520-foot Changabang Peak, The Shining Mountain, Mr. Boardman's prize-winning book describing their ascent, has become a contemporary classic in mountaineering literature. Last summer, Mr. Boardman and Mr. Tasker joined Mr. Bonington on the first ascent of Mount Conger in the Chinese Pamirs. They both possessed great mountain judgment, and although bold and resolute in idea, were also prudent and cautious, Mr. Bonington said in his report to the Chinese. Their loss is enormous for the entire climbing world. On their 4 unsuccessful attempts to reach the summit from their advanced camp at about 26,600 feet, the Seattle-based American climbers led by Lou Whitaker encountered strong winds, freezing temperatures, and blizzards. Miss Hoy is said to have died around the second assault on the summit. Larry Nilsson of the American team climbed solo to roughly 27,500 feet on the third attempt before returning due to severe frostbite. He needed to be dragged down the mountain. A fourth attack was called off due to avalanches. An American team from San Francisco gave up after reaching 22,000 feet due to severe weather last October. Next spring, another American team will attempt to ascend Mount Everest through Tibet. American climbers have reached Everest summit from Nepal, but have yet to reach Tibet. Because it has the world's highest unclimbed mountains and some virtually unexplored alpine terrain, China has become the latest mecca for expedition mountaineers. Boardman's death was reported in the media and transmitted to Hilary Boardman in Lausanne and Dorothy Boardman in Manchester on July 11, 1982. A memorial service was conducted at St. George's Church in Stockport. Hilary Boardman, along with Maria Coffey and Joe Tasker's girlfriend, traveled to the north side of Everest as far as Advanced Base Camp in September 1982 to recreate Boardman and Tasker's previous trek. Boardman and Tasker's high point was not reached on expeditions to the Northeast Ridge in 1985, 1986, or 1987. Russell Bryce and Harry Taylor crossed the Pinnacles in August 1988, completing the unclimbed segment of the route before descending the North Ridge. Due to the thick monsoon snow cover, they observed no indication of Boardman or Tasker. In 1982, a combined Japanese-Kazakh expedition crossed the Pinnacles, but was unable to proceed to the top. They discovered a body beyond the second pinnacle on the Rongbuk side of the ridge, at roughly 8,200 meters. Photographs taken by Vladimir Suviga and transmitted to Chris Bonington allowed the body to be recognized as Peter Boardman, based on his attire and characteristics. The entire ridge was scaled by a Japanese expedition in 1995. They also found a body that was initially believed to be Joe Tasker's. After carefully comparing the written descriptions and photographs provided by each expedition, Chris Bonington came to the conclusion that both sightings were of Boardman. At least it was assumed that this was Joe Tasker, but after carefully considering the written descriptions and pictures provided by each expedition, I became convinced that this was the same as the original sighting, and thus that of Pete. Even now, this section of massive mountain is nearly always avoided due to the several challenges it presents, including the Pinnacles itself, the harsh weather, the wind, the height, and the rough terrain. Almost all of Mount Everest's mountaineering difficulties have now been resolved, but 2 routes still present extraordinary challenges. The Direttissima climb on the avalanche-prone east face, the only direct ascent of Everest to date, and the ascent of the North Pillar on the east face over the fabled Fantasy Ridge. This ridge comes to an end just below the 3 pinnacles in the middle of the Northeast Ridge. On the way to the summit, a climber who wanted to ascend the Fantasy Ridge would have to cross the East Ridge and then ascend the 3 pinnacles on the Northeast Hill. Conquering the top of the world is a romantic yet difficult challenge that only a handful of people have been able to accomplish. The stories about summiting the highest peaks in the world are as much about courage as about tragedy. The Hungarian experience of conquering the Himalayas is no different from any other nation's. It is a mixture of success and great losses. The drama concerning Hungarian climber Szilárd Suhajda in the summit area of Mount Everest did not end well. The search for the 40-year-old was abandoned, despite the superhuman efforts of a search team of top Nepalese mountain guides. Szilárd Suhajda had extensive expertise climbing at high altitudes. In 2014, he became the first person to summit the world's 12th highest peak, Broad Peak, without using an oxygen mask. He was the first Hungarian to ascend K2, the Krakóram Range's 8,611-meter second highest peak, on his own, without the use of oxygen tanks in 2019. Because of his successes, he said in January 2022 that he would attempt to summit all 5 mountains. He succeeded in climbing to the peak of Lhotse in May 2022. As the next step, Suhajda set out to conquer Mount Everest. He set off from the base camp on the 21st of May 2023 and was supposed to reach the top 3 days later. His venture, which seemed to succeed initially, eventually went wrong on May 24 when satellite phone contact was lost with him. A day later, information was received that the climber had been seen unconscious, lying at the bottom of the Hillary Steps at about 8,780 meters. While a rescue group of Sherpas was immediately dispatched to help him, Szilárd Suhajda was never found. On May 27, the rescue team was called back after all hope was lost that Suhajda would still be alive. Szilárd Suhajda set off for the 8,848-meter summit of Mount Everest in Nepal at 9 p.m. local time on Tuesday evening. At the time of publishing our story, the Hungarian climber had been missing for 45 hours. To make matters worse, he's out there without emergency oxygen or personal Sherpa support, so he has to carry his equipment and cope with the elements entirely alone. Ben Ferrer, a member of the Seven Summits Climbs team, was returning from the summit of Everest at 7:30 a.m. on May 24 when he met a climber sitting on the balcony. It was Szilárd Suhajda of Hungary, who was climbing on his own without oxygen. Ferrer snapped a photo, but he never imagined that it would be the last visual record we have of Szilárd. He agreed to share the image as we search for details on his tragic climb. Szilárd last contacted his home team by satellite text or voice, which one is still unclear at 7:45 a.m. Nepal time. At that point, he had reached the balcony at 8,430 meters and said he was feeling strong and the weather was good. The GPS tracking device that Szilárd was carrying, according to Laszlo Pinter, a Hungarian journalist in touch with his home club, isn't always accurate. The climber was found at 8,700 meters by the last signal received this afternoon Nepal time. Since then, there have been no updates, and the mountain is now completely dark. Maybe not until tomorrow morning will we hear more. Szilárd is still carrying his gear and supplies up and down the mountain with no Sherpa to help him with chores like pitching a tent or melting snow for water. Those tasks seem minor at sea level, but are exhausting for a breathless climber at 8,000 meters. Sticking to the criteria of no O2 climbing, he's also carrying no emergency oxygen with him. However, Szilárd stuck to a conservative, well-planned acclimatization strategy that ignored the earlier summit fever around him. On this final push, he left base camp this past weekend and has advanced to 1 camp per day. He asked the altitude of the balcony. It's 8,400 meters, Ferrer told Explorer's Web. He seemed pretty tired, so I incorrectly assumed he was letting his team know his turnaround point altitude. I greeted him briefly. We had chatted in base camp. I asked him how he was doing, and he just replied, "Okay." Ferrer noted at the time the weather was sunny and windless. The conditions for summiting were probably the best of the season that day, with warm temperatures, few people on the mountain, and no clouds or wind, he said. Eventually, Szilárd stood up and continued. 6 hours later, he crossed paths with Elia Saikali. Szilárd was above the balcony, but not much further up. I tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond, said Saikali. He just kept going up, very slowly, but steadily upwards. A determined man, cut from a different cloth. Suhajda was still on his way to the summit at the time. Saikali talked to the Hungarian tabloid Blik, saying that he was almost certain that the Hungarian climber would not survive the summit attempt. I first noticed about 4 p.m. he was traveling steadily and rather slowly. However, it was already very late, and he had not yet reached the south summit, so continuing to climb was extremely dangerous. Elia Saikali reported about the encounter with Szilárd Suhajda and said, "On top of that, the weather conditions, which had been favorable up to that point, started to turn ugly, and the wind picked up, and it started to become dark." In such circumstances, he claimed, the endeavor to summit was all but guaranteed to fail, or even end tragically. The Canadian mountaineer said that he was sure that due to bad timing and his condition, Suhajda would not return. Considering how slowly he was going, and the other hindering factors, there was very little chance he could make the trip. "He should have turned back," said Saikali, who tried to speak to Szilárd Suhajda but received no reply. "The last time I looked at him, he was only about 20 meters below the south summit, but he was still standing and kept going," Elia told Blick. He was able to see Suhajda until he had to help his friend. Elia had been climbing with a fellow athlete, also without oxygen, and although they were going much faster than Suhajda, they knew that they would not reach the south summit in time, and the way back seemed impossible. Eventually, they decided to turn back. The Canadian climber also told Blick that Suhajda did not have a backpack and did not seem to have any emergency plans. Although he did not want to be insensitive, it was obvious there and then that the Hungarian climber had little chance of surviving. But he was determined. He just kept going, he added. Meanwhile, the last photo of the Hungarian climber was published. It was made by Ben Ferrer, a Seven Summits Climbs team member, who was returning from the summit when he met a climber sitting on the balcony. As it turned out, it was Szilárd Suhajda. According to Ferrer, the Hungarian seemed tired, so he incorrectly assumed he was letting his team know his turnaround point. But eventually, Suhajda got up and continued climbing. It was about 6 hours later that he encountered Saikali. Meanwhile, on Monday morning, Sherpas found Szilárd Suhajda's belongings left behind. The jacket and tent were at an altitude of 6,500 meters. The Sherpa who found the equipment is almost certain that it is the Hungarian mountaineer's belongings, as the logos of the companies that supported Suhajda's expedition are visible. There's still no explanation for why he left his equipment at this level, as it is unusual to start directly to the summit from that point, just above Camp 2. The search for missing persons on Everest, including Suhajda and a Sherpa, is still on. Drones will be sent up, but for the time being, they cannot do so because of the bad weather. Sadly, his determination cost him his life. Suhajda Szilárd collapsed at the Hillary Step, very close to the summit. His satellite device gave a signal from 8,795 meters at the Hillary Step altitude late in the night. The following morning, an Imagine Nepal team saw him, slightly off the fixed ropes, and still showing signs of life, but in a very serious state. The team Sherpas were helping a client and couldn't provide further help. It is unknown if someone else saw the climber that day. Gelhe Sherpa and Mikkel Sherpa's rescue team started toward him later that day, but the climber was not there when they reached the Hillary Step on May 26. Szilárd Suhajda perished on Mount Everest while attempting to scale the 8,848-meter peak without the aid of Sherpas or an oxygen tank. Less than 50 meters from the summit, at 8,795 meters, at the base of the Hillary Step, the GPS lost center signal. Suhajda was spotted by other climbers here, but by the time the Sherpas dispatched to rescue him arrived, he had perished. Amidst the breathtaking grandeur of Mount Everest, tragedy has struck with the recent demise of Jonathan Sugarman. As the world grieves his loss, people are trying to unravel the circumstances that led to this heartbreaking event, confronting the unforgiving nature of high-altitude mountaineering. This is the story of Jonathan Sugarman. There was no doubt Jonathan Sugarman felt at home in the mountains. He would send photos to his daughter from treks all over the world, and the joy in his eyes was palpable. "I think the mountains just kind of left him awestruck," said his daughter, Maya Sugarman. He felt the beauty and power in those mountains. On Monday, May 1st, an American named Jonathan Sugarman died during an acclimatization ascent of the world's highest mountain in Camp 2 at around 21,000 feet. The U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu verified the death to outside. This is the fourth fatality on Everest in 2023 and the first for an American. With an exceptional medical career spanning over 4 decades, his daughter said Jonathan Sugarman was dedicated to improving healthcare systems to ensure they followed a patient-first approach. He also founded the Seattle Indian Health Board's residency program, roughly 30 years ago. Arne Vainio, now a doctor on the Fond du Lac Reservation in Minnesota, said he was in his 4th year of medical school, awaiting placement for his residency, when Sugarman called him out of the blue, offering to fly him to Seattle for a tour. Vainio, who is Ojibwe, was impressed by the facility's commitment to native health and inspired by conversations with native doctors, some of whom practiced traditional medicine. Jonathan was always a teacher and really cared for native health, said Vainio. who became one of the Indian Health Board's first residents and was close with Sugarman and his family. Sugarman found his love for climbing and the outdoors as a young man, his daughter said, but put his climbing aside for time to focus on his career and family. But his passion for high places was rekindled in 2010 when he took a trip to Mount Kilimanjaro with his daughter, a former college roommate, and the roommate's son. Tributes poured in for Sugarman, described by various friends and family as a legendary latke chef who was always after the perfect crispness, a lover of the trumpet, and an exceptional humanitarian who touched and changed for the better lives from the deserts of the Navajo Nation to isolated villages in Alaska to the streets of Seattle. During his career, Sugarman climbed a number of peaks, including the 22,837-foot Aconcagua in Argentina and the 20,310-foot Denali in Alaska. He took a climbing excursion to Ecuador in November 2021, according to Uphill Athlete. He climbed Cotopaxi, 19,347 feet, Cayambe, 18,996 feet, and Chimborazo, 20,549 feet, before returning due to avalanche danger. Sugarman landed in the Khumbu Valley with the International Mountain Guides expedition in early April, and the party reached Everest Base Camp on April 10, according to the company's website. According to IMG updates, the group trained for a week on nearby peaks before heading to Everest on April 17th to begin acclimatization treks to higher camps. On April 29th, the party left Everest Base Camp for a higher elevation trip. Half of the team made it to Camp 2, while others remained at Camp 1. The rest of the climbers arrived in Camp 2 on April 30th, with the intention of resting on the 1st of May, before pushing to Camp 3 on May 2nd. Sugarman and the team he was hoping to summit Everest with had been in the area for about a month, acclimatizing to the altitude and training by submitting nearby peaks. In the days before his death, Sugarman left Everest Base Camp, 17,598 feet, with his team, and climbed higher to Camp 2, 20,997 feet, where they were planning to take a rest day Monday before continuing to Camp 3, 23,950 feet. Eric Simonson, CEO and owner of International Mountain Guides, IMG, the organization that planned Sugarman's adventure, confirmed some of those factors in a statement, but declined to share personal details about Sugarman out of respect for his family. It is with deep sorrow that IMG reports the death of one of our Everest 2023 team members at Camp 2, Simonson wrote. We can confirm that this event was not the result of a climbing accident or route condition that would be of potential impact or safety concern to any other teams on the mountain. Simonson went on to say that the remainder of the climbing team was doing as well as could be expected given the circumstances, and he begged the climbing world to give our team and this climber's family the space and time to grieve and contend with their loss. The most recent IMG bulletin does not state whether or not the team intends to continue their acclimatization period. On May 2nd, officials were attempting to transfer Sugarman's remains to lower levels. According to the Everest Chronicle, Sugarman had participated in numerous international mountaineering trips. Sugarman gave an interview to the coaching website Uphill Athlete in August 2022, where he explained his climbing background. He claimed to have stopped playing the sport in college, only to resume it in his 50s. I climbed in college but quit cold turkey when I found myself doing something that had recently resulted in deaths. I realized I wasn't being very concerned. I dragged a climbing rope harness and rack around for years though, he admitted. Sugarman returned to the sport decades after leaving. A college flatmate urged him to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. Although I wasn't really interested, my daughter, then in college, asked if she could come, which sealed the deal. A few months later, I climbed Mount Rainier, joined the Mountaineers in Seattle, took a couple of climbing courses, and then embarked on several domestic and international climbs. Sugarman had compiled an impressive list of peaks over his career, including a successful ascent of Argentina's 22,837-foot Aconcagua and Alaska's 20,310-foot Denali. He took a climbing excursion to Ecuador in November 2021. According to Uphill Athlete, he climbed Cotopaxi, 19,347 feet, Cayambe, 18,996 feet, and Chimborazo, 20,549 feet, before returning due to avalanche danger. In a Facebook post, Uphill Athlete founder Steve House described Sugarman as a lovely person. I recall Jonathan from his time at Uphill Athlete in 2021. He was a fascinating and intelligent man, wrote House. I admired both his humility and his eagerness to learn. I'm sending my condolences to his friends, family, and everyone else affected by this tragedy. Maya Sugarman, 34, said memories of her father's kindness and strong moral compass have helped her push through the pain in the weeks since his death. He was really like a mensch, she said. His daughter said he accomplished his 2022 goal of reaching Everest's Camp 3, but the mountain kept calling. Sugarman was prepared, diligent, and had the technical skills and experience to aim for the summit this year, and he was conscious about mitigating the risks inherent in such a climb, Maya Sugarman said. She said her father's work in healthcare reflected his value of doing as much as he could to serve others. After working for the Indian Health Board, he joined a non-profit consulting firm now known as Co-Imagine Health in 1995, rising to become the president and CEO. Evan Stultz, who worked with Jonathan Sugarman for nearly 25 years, said his former colleague helped raise the bar. Sugarman led the non-profit through several landmark initiatives to improve patient healthcare, Stultz said, and the organization's revenue and headcount more than doubled under his leadership from 2001 to 2018. Sugarman had previously suffered from high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, a potentially lethal condition induced by rapid elevation gain. His interview with Uphill Athlete included a discussion of the training routine he employed to overcome the disease. He suffered from HAPE while attempting to summit the 26,864-foot Cho Oyu in 2016, and had to abandon his expedition after reaching Camp 1 at 21,000 feet. Both peaks were fun and gave me the confidence that I was fit enough to go through the Khumbu icefall, Sugarman told Uphill Athlete last year. Traveling through the icefall was amazing. I was overcome with emotion to be looking at the Western Khum, Nuptse, Lhotse, and Everest in real life instead of just in pictures. Sugarman leaves behind his wife, Teresa Sullivan, back home in Seattle, and his daughter, Maya Sugarman, in Los Angeles. In the shadow of Mount Everest's towering colossus, a tragic tale emerges, that of the enigmatic Sleeping Beauty. As the world's highest peak stood as both an alluring siren and a formidable challenge, her story unfolded amidst the thin air, icy winds, determination, and destiny that took a heart-wrenching turn. Mount Everest usually reminds climbers not to be arrogant or undervalue the power of nature. A person stranded 29,000 feet in the air, where temperatures can plummet to 160 degrees below zero, cannot be helped by technology. Anyone who starts their ascent with confidence is shortly made aware of their difficulties, and the remains of unfortunate ascendants act as grisly markers along the route to the summit. These remains on Mount Everest were left where they fell because it was too risky to try and collect them. They were perfectly preserved in the bitter cold and wearing gear that reflected the many decades in which they fell victim to the mountain's wrath. This is the sad story of the famous Sleeping Beauty of Mount Everest, as narrated by Ian Woodall and Cathy O'Dowd, who were also climbing to the summit when they came across Francis Arsentiev, known as the Sleeping Beauty of Mount Everest. American mountaineer Francis Arsentiev died tragically atop Earth's highest peak on May 24, 1998. Before she passed away while descending from the mountain, she was the first woman from the United States to reach Mount Everest's summit without bottled oxygen on May 22, 1998. Her cause of death, hypothermia, and cerebral edema, may be due to exposure to very cold temperatures for a long time. Born on January 18, 1958, in the enchanting landscapes of Honolulu, Hawaii, Francis Yarbrough de Stefano Arsentiev was destined to weave a tale of extraordinary achievements. A blend of cultures and experiences marked her upbringing as she traversed between the United States and the picturesque lands of Switzerland. After completing her undergraduate studies at the University of Louisville, Francis earned a master's from the International School of Business Management in Phoenix. During the vibrant era of the 1980s, Francis found herself immersed in the lively ski town of Telluride, Colorado, where she pursued a career as an accountant. In this magnetic setting, fate intervened, introducing her to the legendary Russian climber Sergei Arsentiev, The sparks of their connection were undeniable, and in 1992, their lives were intertwined in matrimony. Frances went to Nepal in May 1998 for the Everest expedition. She had a group, including Sergei Arsentiev, her husband. The first attempt to ascend Mount Everest was attempted on May 20th, 1998. They were unable to complete the ascent because, as is typical on the first try, their headlights did not turn on. They returned, gathered their thoughts, and planned before beginning their second trip at the summit on May 21st. Once more, misfortune compelled the two to reverse course after barely 50 to 100 meters of ascent. Eventually, after multiple difficult efforts, they succeeded in reaching the summit of Mount Everest. Frances' achievement made her the first American woman to climb Everest without the help of oxygen tanks. The Mount Everest Sleeping Beauty was Frances Arsentiev, an American mountaineer who perished on the summit in 1998. The multiple weather-related challenges they encountered made the mission challenging. Due to the high gusts they encountered, the team was forced to reschedule their trip many times. They had to stay on the mountain because there was no clear weather. They had very little brain ability left since they were so mentally drained from the lack of air. They had to stay in the danger zone, commonly known as altitudes exceeding 8,000 meters, for a total of 3 days. Another issue was becoming separated on the route to the base camp. After her husband went to the base camp, Frances became disoriented. This time, Sergei went back to look for her while carrying oxygen. They couldn't attempt to pull the body down thousands of feet to base camp because of how high the mountain is, and because they might meet the same end as Frances. She probably wouldn't have survived the arduous voyage to base camp, and it would have been nearly impossible to make it with her. Frances' husband, Sergei, had lost her on the way down. When Sergei arrived at the camp, Frances was not there. Instead of heading back up, he was encouraged to wait and let her visit the camp. He then waited for hours. When he was unable to wait any longer, he stepped outside to find Frances. He searched all day, but tragically, he also perished on the mountain. Sergei was located 1 year later. He seemed to have collapsed like Frances and bled to death. On Everest, the dead are left where they fell, serving as grisly reminders to climbers that nature ultimately has the final say. Whether you have climbed it before doesn't matter. No matter how skilled you are, nature determines whether you scale Everest by the day, the hour, or even the minute. Having been haunted by abandoning Frances and having to look at climber images of the woman for years, a crew was assembled to return and give Frances a respectable funeral. They carried her out of the passageway as she was covered in the American flag. As a result, climbers were unable to locate her and stopped taking pictures of her. The Sleeping Beauty story climbers are familiar with Everest, but more as a warning. Not all stories are uplifting or inspiring. Frances Arsentiev spent several nights slowly dying. Her cognitive capacities were considerably impaired by the lack of oxygen in the high-altitude area. As a result, Frances died as she descended to Mount Everest's base camp. Sometimes they are more careful, and that's what Frances Arsentiev's story is. Her story tells of achieving your goals and the dangers that await them when scaling down Everest. It will never be known for sure what caused her death. High altitude, oxygen deprivation, weariness, injuries, or other factors may have contributed. According to experts, if she had been at a lower level, she might have managed without additional oxygen. High-altitude climbers often refer to this tale as a warning not to set out on their ascent without extra oxygen. An insufficient oxygen supply was most likely a major contributing factor to Arsentiev's ultimate fate. Arsentiev and her husband didn't bring enough oxygen bottles when they embarked on the journey, which, combined with exhaustion from the trek, was perhaps the dominating factor in the Arsentiev's unfortunate fate. As hikers typically experience physical weakness and extreme fatigue near the mountain's summit, Arsentiev may have laid down to rest against her backpack, later finding that she was unable to get up again. A group of hikers from Uzbekistan first found Arsentiev. The hikers tried to help her, giving her a few oxygen bottles as well as carrying her down the mountain. But sadly, all their efforts ultimately failed when their own oxygen became depleted. But they did encounter Arsentiev's husband, Sergei, on the couple's way back and tried to direct him towards his wife. This was the last time Sergei Arsenyev was seen alive. Since neither Francis nor Sergei Arsenyev returned from their journey to Mount Everest, the exact sequence of events surrounding their demise is impossible to know. Many believe, however, that the couple separated after being forced to camp in Everest's death zone overnight. Possibly delirious due to a lack of oxygen, Francis may have left camp sometime during the night. Sergei would then have awoken to find her gone, and searched for her throughout the mountains. The crew from Francis was unable to descend due to the severe weather conditions at the peak of Mount Everest. She was forced to spend numerous hours on the summit, which caused hypothermia and frostbite. The Mount Everest Sleeping Beauty was Francis Arsenyev, an American mountaineer who perished on the summit in 1998. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed today's video, then make sure to leave us a thumbs up, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel and click on the bell icon to always be updated with the latest content as soon as it's uploaded. Thanks for watching. See you again soon in another video.